Okay, economists, here's the plan for this week's homework question. The question is discuss. So we know it's two-sided and needs an evaluative conclusion. The extent to which, so the judgment will be around how far we agree with this statement. Globalisation, which is the economic theory, has been mostly beneficial. So if we agree with it, we're saying yes, it's been mostly beneficial, but we could also have a judgment that no, it's been mostly detrimental for economies. When it says for economies, this is leaving it open to you to decide examples. A good way to apply this would be to developed in less economically developed countries. So quick plan for that in terms of our knowledge. We're going to want to define globalization. The application, like I said, would be examples from developed or developing countries. Some of the causes of globalization will also give us a bit of application. We said in the lesson that we looked at kind of globalization, but changing it for some of the features of globalization. So we could make this an argument about free trade, but we could also make this an argument about FDI as well. So we can use that to kind of substitute here. So we've got the positives of free trade, and I said we'd try and use the comparative advantage argument, and then the case for protectionism. So we'd use the infant industry or sunrise industry argument. For FDI, if you have time, you could use the argument in terms of job creation, but then we could also use the argument against FDI if it being capital intensive. Then when it comes to it depends upon, we'll try and solve one of those if we're going to try and agree that we think globalization has been mostly beneficial. So we'll talk about how globalization can happen and not have those two negatives there. So in terms of the definition, the keywords that we're looking for linked to this little picture in terms of connections. So either the interdependence or the growing interdependence of economies, or increasing interconnectedness. I looked it up on Google and apparently it is a word, of markets. In terms of our examples of developing and developed economies, we could give examples of things like EU in terms of free trade areas. We could look at Africa or Southeast Asia as examples of increasing privatization and deregulation of markets in terms of increasing free market economies. We could also look in terms of the EU at the single market if we want to apply more movement of people. You can include this in the introduction, or you can just define it quickly in the introduction and use the application throughout the rest of the essay. Okay, so the case for globalization we said could be a free trade one. Cartoon here says tall dude should specialize in apple picking, short dude should specialize in strawberry picking. So based on their advantages, that's what they're going to specialize in. So the best way we can do this is using the comparative advantage argument. So the case for free trade, or the benefits of globalization, would be free trade, and the benefits of free trade come from comparative advantages. So we define a comparative advantage, the lowest relative opportunity cost. We'd give an example, so here we'll have Kenya, and then we'll also have the UK, and the UK will specialise in financial services, and Kenya will specialise in the production of flowers. We'll start off with the production of both goods being the same in both countries. So Kenya is producing that amount of financial services and that amount of flowers, and the UK is doing the same. It's producing that amount of financial services and that amount of flowers. Now if we add these two together, so we're going to kind of double this amount here, we'll end up somewhere here in terms of flowers, the total amount, and we'll end up somewhere here in terms of the total amount of financial services. And if we join those together, currently that's the world production of those two things. If we then increase, or we specialise in our two things, so the UK comes over here and it produces no flowers, but it now produces a lot of financial services, and Kenya specialises in flowers, so it produces a lot of flowers, but it produces no financial services. Then that's the amount of financial services, flowers we're producing now. This is the amount of financial services. So now the total world production is up here. And what that means is we have an increase in production. And the difference between those two can be traded between the countries. So the extra flowers that Kenya has could go to the UK. The extra financial services of the UK can go to Kenya. So in total, both countries benefit. And just to break that process down into analysis, so we've got our definition there. Our application is those two different products, so flowers and financial services. The steps in the process are we specialise in the lowest opportunity costs. This specialisation leads to an increase in output from the same factors of production. That leads to a surplus where domestic demand is less than supply. That surplus is traded because the quantity has gone up, and because the quantity has gone up, the price has gone down. That means that consumers or consumption increases in both countries, and that means that standards of living have risen. So a lot of analysis in there. If that's the only argument you get down for globalisation, that's fine. It's a very okay. So another argument for could be that FDI brings capital investment. So you could say globalisation leads to FDI because there is a free movement of capital, or freer movement of capital. This increases the productive potential of an economy. If you want, you could add your long run average supply graph to that. That leads to increased employment or jobs. This will increase incomes. Higher incomes lead to higher spending on goods and services, which will lead to again an increase in standard of living. So a less detailed explanation of why globalisation is good, but if you're more confident with that argument, that's an equally valid argument to make. Coming to our negatives, so the case against globalisation, one of them will be that free trade is bad, so therefore protectionism is good. And if your argument that protectionism is good, then you could argue it from the infant industry or sunrise industry argument. And what you're saying is that infant industries, because they are small and they lack economies of scale, then they can't compete globally. And if they can't compete, then your businesses would lose out, and it would lead to job losses as the international competition is stronger, it gains economies of scale. So if you protect them, if you kind of protect against globalization, so if you add a tariff or a quota or a regulation or whatever, then you will keep jobs domestically, and that will allow your country to grow and prevent kind of the negatives of those job losses. The argument against FDI could be that capital intensive argument, or you could talk about how the tax evasion or tax avoidance leads to a leakage from the circular flow of income. So you end up with businesses taking their profits back out of the economy. They aren't paying taxes to the government, so there's no kind of reinvestment from the government either. So you've got a lack of public services if people are avoiding taxes, but you've got a lack of skills or jobs if it's capital intensive. Okay. In terms of the conclusion, two ways to do this. If you are going to argue that globalization is good, so you're going to make the judgment that globalization is good, you could say that protectionism in the short term may be justified to allow a transition to a new comparative advantage, and then this would be removed when they've gained economy of scale. You can make a similar argument for sunset industries to allow or to prevent structural unemployment. If you're doing it for sunrise industries, it's about allowing them to gain economies of scale, so when they get to the size. A good application for that is South Korea, because that's effectively what they did to allow them to develop. If you are going to look against capital intensive, there's two ways you could do that. One of them could be some kind of government regulation as a stick, or a carrot could be some kind of government incentives, so lower taxes or subsidies to encourage labour intensive investment as well. Or it could be that you tax quite heavily the capital intensive industries and you use that tax to increase education in the rest of the economy.